The briefing packet said he was there to watch. Commander Elias Voss, United Earth Diplomatic Corps, sat in the rear observation gallery of the ESV Meridian and told himself that for the 47th time in 6 days, he was there to watch. Not speak. Not advise. Certainly not to intervene. He had a notepad, analog, deliberately so. The Venkara delegation had reportedly expressed discomfort with the electromagnetic signatures of active computing devices during initial proximity exchanges. Someone at the UEDC had actually thought of that. Voss had been quietly impressed. Usually, Earth's diplomatic apparatus moved with the grace of a cargo freighter navigating a parking structure. But they'd gotten this right. Mostly. The Meridian was a science vessel, repurposed. Her military escort, the frigate INS Chandra, kept 12,000 kilometers of deliberate distance. Close enough to respond, far enough to signal restraint. The positioning had been calculated by 3 separate working groups over 9 months. Every variable had been modeled. Every outcome weighted. Voss was the variable nobody had fully modeled. He wasn't a diplomat by formal training. His background was in xenolinguistics and comparative threat assessment, a pairing that sounded contradictory until you understood that language, at its core, was the original negotiation tactic. He'd spent 11 years cataloging contact protocols from Earth's own historical record, the encounters between isolated human civilizations, the patterns of dominance and deference, the moments where a single misread gesture had cascaded into war. The UEDC had recruited him not because he was the most qualified person in the room, but because he was the most careful. That was the word his supervisor, Director Fenn, had used during his assignment briefing on Lunar Station 4. Careful. You notice things other people rationalize away, Fenn had told him. And you don't panic about what you notice. That's rare. Voss had accepted the posting without enthusiasm. He was not a man who confused significance with excitement. This mission was significant. That didn't make it thrilling. Made it heavy. The Venkara had made first contact 14 months ago, not with Earth's military, not with its governments, but with a deep space relay station staffed by 6 technicians on a routine maintenance rotation. The contact had been soft, a structured signal, mathematically elegant, embedded in a frequency band that Earth's own early warning systems had been programmed to flag as non-natural. Whoever the Venkara were, they understood that first contact with a species requires meeting that species where it is, not where you are. That alone had told Earth's analysts something important. The Venkara had done this before. The 14 months since had been a careful, exhausting exchange of foundational communication frameworks. Not conversation, not yet. More like 2 parties sliding documents under a door, each one slightly more complex than the last, each one testing whether the other could follow. Earth had fielded a rotating team of mathematicians, linguists, and cognitive scientists. The Venkara had responded with what could only be described as patience, a quality that Earth's analysts found simultaneously reassuring and deeply unnerving. Patient species in Earth's own historical record tended to be either very wise or very dangerous. The Meridian's meeting today was the first face-to-face exchange. Or face to whatever they have exchange. The imagery transmitted during the communication phases had suggested bilateral symmetry, bipedal locomotion, and a cranial structure that was almost humanoid, different enough to remind you of the distance, similar enough to make your brain keep reaching for familiar categories. The xenobiology team had warned everyone about that specifically. Do not let pattern recognition substitute for actual observation. Voss had underlined that memo 3 times. He was in the gallery because the primary diplomatic team, Ambassadors Chin and Okonkwo, flanked by 2 military liaisons, occupied the forward reception chamber. The gallery above offered a full view through reinforced transparent aluminum panels. He could see everything. He could affect nothing. That was the assignment. He settled his notepad on his knee, clicked his pen, and waited. The Venkara shuttle had already docked. He'd watched its approach on the secondary display to his left. A sleek, elongated craft that moved with a kind of hydraulic precision, no wasted motion, no adjustment burns. Whoever was piloting it was either extremely experienced or the craft's navigation systems were substantially more refined than Earth's current generation. He wrote that down. Navigation, no correction burns. Either exceptional pilot or autonomous systems of high sophistication. The airlock indicator above the reception chamber cycled from amber to green. Voss leaned forward slightly, not because he was excited but because he was already working, cataloging angles, distances, the positioning of the diplomatic team, the subtle rigidity in Ambassador Chen's shoulders that suggested she was managing anxiety through deliberate stillness. The inner door opened. For Venkara entered the chamber. Voss's pen was already moving. He was noting posture, the way the lead figure, taller, with some kind of rank indicator along the collar, paused 2 steps inside the threshold. A territory acknowledgement gesture, possibly. He wrote it down. He was noting the way the second figure moved slightly to the left, creating a wider formation than a typical honor guard would adopt. He was noting the light bronze coloration of their environment suits, the lack of visible weapons. Not just absence but deliberate absence, the kind that comes from removing something rather than never having it. He was noting all of this when the 4th member of the Venkara delegation, younger by some visual indicator he couldn't yet define, positioned at the rear, turned. Not toward Ambassador Chin. Not toward the diplomatic team. Upward. Toward the gallery. Toward Elias Voss. The young Venkara's gaze, dark, structured, unsettlingly direct, locked onto him with an expression that Voss's brain immediately tried to categorize and failed. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't alarm. It was something more specific than either. Then the young delegate raised one hand, extended a finger, and said something. The chamber's translation feed, still rough, still approximate, but functional, rendered it 7 seconds later through the small earpiece Voss wore as a passive monitor. Him. He is my chosen partner. The reception chamber went completely still. Ambassador Chen turned slowly to look up at the gallery, and Voss could see, even from distance, the precise moment her diplomatic composure collided with genuine confusion. He looked down at his notepad. He had been writing steadily since the door opened. His pen was still in his hand. He had not written a single word in the last 40 seconds. The silence in the reception chamber lasted 4 seconds. Voss counted them. In high-stakes diplomatic environments, silence has texture. 2 seconds is pause. 3 seconds is recalibration. 4 seconds means something has happened that nobody's protocol manual prepared for, and every trained professional in the room is simultaneously running triage on what that means. Ambassador Yemisi Okonkwo recovered first. That was her gift. Not eloquence, not strategic brilliance, but the ability to absorb a shock and keep moving before anyone else finished processing it. She turned back to the lead Venkara delegate with a measured, open posture and offered a greeting phrase from the pre-established communication framework. Warm tone. Stable cadence. The verbal equivalent of keeping your hands visible. The lead delegate responded. The exchange continued. The young Venkara at the rear had not looked away from the gallery. From Voss. Commander Elias Voss sat with his notepad on his knee and his pen uncapped and understood, with the particular clarity that comes from training and temperament rather than panic, that he was now the central variable in humanity's most consequential diplomatic encounter. He had not moved. He had not spoken. He had not, to his knowledge, done anything. And yet. He wrote, subject, designation, Venkara Cadet, provisional, maintains sustained visual contact with gallery position. Duration, 47 seconds and counting. Facial expression stable, not distress, not challenge. Intentional. He underlined intentional twice. The translation feed crackled softly in his ear. The primary diplomatic exchange was proceeding. Ambassador Chen had regained her composure and was walking through the pre-established ceremonial acknowledgement sequence, the one that 9 months of communication protocol had built toward. The Venkara lead was responding within expected parameters. That was good. It also meant that nobody, officially, was dealing with what had just happened. Voss activated the discrete comm channel to the Meridian Situation Room with a single button press on his wrist unit. Dr. Annika Holm, the mission's lead xenolinguist, would be monitoring. Gallery to situation, he said, voice low and flat. I need a linguistic pull on the phrase just spoken by Venkara Delegate 4. The translation feed rendered it as chosen partner. I want to know the confidence interval on that rendering and whether partner is the closest approximation or whether there are alternative translations the algorithm discarded. Pause. Holmes' voice came back tight with barely managed urgency. Already pulling it. The confidence interval on the core phrase is 74%. The base term the algorithm mapped to partner, Venkaran root is something like Velashan, has at least 4 contextual variants in the corpus we've built. It can mean partner, counterpart, complement, or a pause, co-navigator. Co-navigator, Voss repeated. In the navigational sense, yes. But also in older usage contexts, it carries something closer to the one who reads the same horizon. It's not a casual phrase, Elias. He wrote all of that down, then added, not casual. Not improvisational. The cadet knew this word before entering the room. That was the piece that mattered. This hadn't been an impulsive gesture. Venkaran linguistics, based on 14 months of exchanges, showed a grammatical structure that embedded intentionality markers into verb-adjacent phrases. You couldn't accidentally use velation and have it mean something significant. You chose it. The cadet had chosen it. Which meant the cadet had prepared it. Which meant someone had allowed the cadet to prepare it. Voss looked down at the reception chamber again. The formal exchange was proceeding smoothly. Ambassador Chen was presenting the cultural artifact package that Earth had prepared, a sealed data module containing art, music, mathematical records, historical archive samples. The Venkara lead received it with both hands, which the xenobiology team had pre-identified as a high-dignity acceptance gesture. Good signs, all of it. The cadet had finally looked away from the gallery. They now stood in their position at the rear, still and attentive, watching the ceremony with an expression Voss couldn't read. Young, he noted again. The size differential was slight. Venkara adults appeared to average somewhat taller than humans, but the proportional indicators suggested this individual was not fully mature by their species' developmental standards. A cadet. The title from the translation feed had been provisional, flagged by the algorithm as approximate, but the conceptual match was reasonable. A student. An apprentice. Someone still learning. Why would a first contact delegation include a student? Voss wrote the question down and stared at it. In Earth's own historical contact records, not with aliens obviously, but with isolated human civilizations encountering the wider world, delegations were composed carefully. Every member served a function. You didn't bring observers without reason. You didn't bring junior members without intent. The Venkara had been patient. They had been deliberate. They had spent 14 months learning Earth's communication structures before agreeing to a face-to-face exchange. They did not, based on everything the UEDC analysis teams had concluded, do things without reason. So why was this cadet here? And why, of all the people aboard the ESV Meridian, the two ambassadors, the military liaisons, the science crew, the support staff, had that cadet looked past all of them and fixed on him? He wasn't prominent. He wasn't positioned prominently. He was in a secondary gallery that wasn't even listed on the formal layout documents shared with the Venkara during pre-meeting exchanges. The shared schematics had shown the forward reception chamber, the airlock approach corridor, and the ambassador suite. The observation gallery had been listed as support infrastructure. The Venkara cadet had found him anyway. They studied the ship, he wrote. Beyond the shared schematics. They mapped it themselves. That was either a significant capability indicator or a significant intelligence indicator. Possibly both. His comm channel opened again. This time it was Director Fenn, patched in from the Meridian's command deck. His voice carried the particular controlled quality of someone who was working very hard to sound calm. Voss. The diplomatic team is requesting a recess. 15 minutes. We need to discuss the statement that was made. Understood. Are you available to come down to the situation room? He looked at the reception chamber. The cadet had turned again. Not toward the gallery this time, toward the airlock door as if listening to something Voss couldn't hear. Yes, Voss said. I'm available. He capped his pen, stood, and for the first time in 6 days aboard the Meridian, felt the full weight of what Fenn had said to him during the assignment briefing on Lunar Station 4. You notice things other people rationalize away. He'd noticed plenty. The question now was what it meant and what humanity was supposed to do about it. The situation room aboard the ESV Meridian was not designed for drama. It was designed for function. A rectangular space, deliberately neutral, 8 chairs around a central table with integrated displays, a secondary screen for the translation corpus, 2 separate air filtration units installed after someone's preliminary report noted that the Venkara might have different atmospheric tolerances and cross-contamination protocols should be considered during the proximity phase. Even the contingencies had contingencies. That was how humanity had approached this. Voss entered to find 7 people already seated or standing. Ambassador Chen was at the head of the table, hands flat on the surface, posture that of someone maintaining composure through physical deliberateness. Ambassador Okonkwo sat to her left, notepad open, already writing. Commander Halid Asker, the senior military liaison, stood near the wall display with his arms crossed. Not defensively, Voss had learned, but because it was how he thought. Dr. Holm was at the far end with her translation corpus open on the table display. 2 UEDC analysts he recognized by face but not name. And Director Fenn, standing near the door, who looked at Voss when he entered with an expression that carried precisely the information a look like that is designed to carry. This is yours now. Voss sat down. 14 minutes, Ambassador Chen said. Let's use them. Dr. Home, translation confidence. 74% on the primary phrase. The core term Velashan has multiple contextual registers. Home walked through what she'd already told Voss, efficiently and without repetition. The room listened. The diplomatic register would render closest to counterpart, a formal pairing with functional connotations. The navigational register gives us co-navigator, which has historical depth in the Venkaran corpus. There's also a philosophical register. We've only seen it twice in the full communication archive, where the term appears to mean something like the one whose perspective completes a picture I cannot see alone. Silence. Asker uncrossed his arms. That's not a casual thing to say. No, Home agreed. It's not. Then the question, Ambassador Okonkwo said, is whether this was sanctioned by the delegation leadership or whether it was aberrant. Every head turned toward Voss. He hadn't spoken yet. He opened his notepad on the table. It wasn't aberrant. The cadet prepared that phrase. Velashan carries intentionality markers grammatically. You can't use it accidentally in a significant register. And the delegation entered this room knowing the cadet was going to use it. Nobody moved to correct or neutralize the statement. The lead delegate continued the ceremony without pause. That's either pre-coordination or a demonstration of remarkable trust in the junior member. He paused. Given everything we know about how carefully the Venkara have managed this engagement, I'd say pre-coordination. So it was deliberate, Chin said. The whole delegation knew. Yes. Why? Asker asked. Why send a message through a junior delegate? Why not address us directly? Voss had been turning that over since the gallery. Because direct address carries weight that may not have been appropriate for this stage. If the lead delegate had said it, it becomes a formal diplomatic statement. Something we'd have to respond to formally, which creates pressure and potentially obligation in a context where we haven't established the framework to handle that yet. He tapped his notepad. Using the cadet creates distance. It registers the message without demanding an immediate response. It gives both sides room. That's sophisticated, Okonkwo said quietly. They've done this before, Voss said. We know that. Whatever this is, this protocol, it isn't new. The room sat with that for a moment. The question of why you specifically, Fen said from the wall, hasn't been addressed. Voss had been hoping they'd get there. The cadet found me in a gallery that wasn't in the shared schematics. That means they surveyed the ship beyond what we provided. They identified me. They prepared a phrase for me specifically. He looked around the table. So either they have intelligence on the Meridian's crew that we didn't know they were developing, or they identified me during the approach and made a decision in real time. Both possibilities have significant implications. Intelligence gathering during a diplomatic approach, Asker said flatly. That's not a neutral act. No. But it's also not necessarily hostile. It's thorough. Voss paused. In Earth's own history, reconnaissance before engagement was considered responsible, not aggressive, depending on intent. We don't know their intent. And if their intent is to establish a direct line of communication with someone outside the formal diplomatic structure? Chin asked. Then they're telling us something about how they prefer to work, Voss said. Or they're testing whether we're flexible enough to operate outside our own formal structures when circumstances require it. Another silence. Longer this time. Okonkwo set her pen down. If we don't acknowledge it, we risk signaling rigidity. That we can't adapt. If we acknowledge it without knowing what it means, Asker countered, we risk committing to something we don't understand. What we know, Holmes said carefully, is that the term Velashan has appeared in the Venkaran corpus in contexts of long-term collaboration. Not transaction. Not short-term negotiation. Whatever they're proposing or gesturing toward, it's not small. Everyone looked at Voss again. He understood why. He didn't particularly like it, but he understood it. What do you need from us? Chin asked him directly. If we send you back into that chamber, in whatever capacity, what do you need? He thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved. Permission to respond to the cadet directly if the opportunity arises. Not formally. Not as a diplomatic statement. Just acknowledgement. Let them know the message was received. That's all. For now. He closed his notepad. And I need whatever the intelligence division has on how the Venkara might have identified my role on this ship. Not because it changes anything immediately. Because I want to understand what they saw when they looked at me. He paused. And whether what they saw was accurate. The timer on the wall display read 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Ambassador Chin straightened in her chair. All right, she said. Here's what we're going to do. The intelligence brief took 12 hours to compile and 6 minutes to read. That asymmetry was not accidental. The UEDC's analysis division, operating from Lunar Station 4 and a relay node at the L2 Lagrange point, had been working since the moment of the Cadet's statement, coordinating with the Meridian's own sensor logs and the INS Chandra's long-range observation records. What they produced was not a comprehensive report. It was a preliminary picture, carefully qualified, with uncertainty ranges attached to every inference. Voss respected that. Certainty in intelligence analysis was usually a warning sign. The picture the brief assembled was this. During the 47-minute approach phase before the Venkara shuttle docked, the Venkaran vessel had emitted a passive scanning signature. Low-intensity, spread spectrum, the kind that Earth sensors had registered as background noise and logged without flagging. In retrospect, with the parameters adjusted, it was clearly active surveying. The Meridian's hull offered limited resistance to that kind of scan at close range. Thermal signatures, electromagnetic activity distribution, atmospheric composition in different compartments, all of it would have been readable. They hadn't scanned for weapons. Or rather, the distribution of the scan didn't prioritize defensive systems. It prioritized people. Specifically, the variance in electromagnetic signatures that corresponded to individual biological activity. Heat maps. Movement patterns. The small, persistent differences between a person sitting at a command console running active systems and a person sitting in an observation gallery with an analog notepad. The analysis team's conclusion flagged at 68% confidence. The Venkara had produced a population map of the Meridian during approach. Not names, not roles, they couldn't have had that level of resolution, but positions, activity levels, and behavioral signatures. And in the observation gallery what they would have seen was one person. Sitting still. Watching. Not operating any systems. Not participating in the diplomatic preparation activity visible in the forward sections of the ship. Someone who was there to observe. Someone who was, by function if not by title, doing exactly what the Venkaran cadet's phrase implied. Reading the room without participating in it. Seeing the whole picture. Voss read the brief, then set it down on the desk in the small cabin the Meridian had assigned him, and looked at the bulkhead for a while. They hadn't chosen him because of his credentials. They hadn't chosen him because of his rank, which was modest, or his institutional position, which was deliberately obscure. They'd chosen him because of what he was doing when they looked. The behavior matched the role the cadet's phrase described. The one whose perspective completes a picture I cannot see alone. Not a strategist. Not a negotiator. An observer. A reader. He found that more unsettling than any of the alternatives would have been, because it meant the Venkara had correctly identified a function that his own institution had only partially acknowledged. The UEDC had brought him as a supplementary analyst, useful but not central. The Venkara had looked at the ship and seen immediately that the person sitting alone watching everything might be the most important person on it. Whether that conclusion was accurate or a misreading was a separate question. But they'd made it. And they'd made it based on observation rather than documentation. He picked up his notepad and wrote, "They reason empirically. They trust what they see over what they're told. Note for all future interactions." The formal diplomatic session had resumed after the recess. Ambassador Chen had handled it masterfully, acknowledging the cadet's statement with a brief, neutral phrase that the translation team had constructed carefully. Something that said, "We received your words and will consider them," without committing to any particular interpretation or response. The lead Venkara delegate had accepted this with what appeared to be satisfaction. The cadet had remained still throughout. The session had concluded on schedule, with the foundational framework agreements intact and a second meeting proposed for 72 hours hence. That was good. That was, by every metric the mission had set, a success. But 72 hours was a narrow window, and Voss had been asked, by Chen, confirmed in writing through Fen, to prepare a response framework for the cadet's statement before the next session. Not a diplomatic reply. A contact approach. How to acknowledge the gesture without either dismissing it or overcommitting to it. How to communicate that Earth had understood, was taking it seriously, and was capable of the kind of long-horizon thinking the phrase implied. He'd been given no formal authority beyond observer status. He'd been given no additional staff. He'd been given a cabin, his notepad, access to Holmes' translation corpus, and 72 hours. He started writing. The first problem was the nature of velation itself. In every contextual register, the term implied reciprocity. A co-navigator was not a follower or a guide. The prefix structure of the word embedded mutual function. Both parties contributed. Both parties were necessary to reach the destination. If Voss was being offered the role of Velashin to the cadet, then the cadet was simultaneously offering themselves in the same role to him. That was not a request. That was a proposal. The question was, a proposal for what? Holmes' corpus showed Velashin appearing in only 6 confirmed diplomatic contexts in the 14 months of communication exchange. All 6 were in what the analysis team had classified as deep time texts, documents that appeared to be historical in nature, not contemporary. In those contexts, Velashin relationships were described as lasting years, sometimes decades. They involved ongoing exchange, mutual learning, and, this was the piece that kept surfacing, parallel perspective management. One partner saw what the other could not. Together they produced understanding that neither could reach independently. Not a translator. Not a liaison. Something more like a counterpart reader. A person whose function was to see the things you were too close to see. Voss understood, with the particular quiet certainty of someone who has spent a career in pattern recognition, why that might appeal to a species that had been doing first contact for long enough to develop formalized protocols for it. You could build all the communication frameworks you wanted. You could exchange all the mathematical proofs and cultural artifact modules your diplomatic teams produced. But if you wanted to truly understand a species, not their formal presentation but their actual texture, their reasoning patterns, their instincts under pressure, you needed someone on the inside who could tell you what you were actually looking at. They'd looked at the meridian and found the one person whose job was to do exactly that. And they were asking if he'd do it in both directions. He looked at his notepad. He'd filled 6 pages. On the 7th he wrote a single line. The question isn't whether I accept. The question is whether Earth can afford the implications if I do. The report Voss submitted to Director Fenn at hour 51 was 43 pages long and contained 17 formal recommendations, 11 of which were prefaced with the phrase if Earth chooses to engage. That conditional was not hedging. It was honesty. Because the picture that had emerged from 72 hours of analysis, Voss alone, home intermittently 2 UEDC analysts for specific corpus pulls, was not ambiguous. It was specific, and its specificity was the problem. Not because it indicated threat. Because it indicated depth, and depth meant long-term implications that nobody in Earth's diplomatic apparatus had positioned themselves to evaluate. The Velashin proposal, as Voss had come to think of it, was not a friendship gesture. It was not a cultural nicety. It was a formal institutional offer, and not from the cadet alone. He'd found it by tracking back through the communication corpus, looking for structural parallels to the phrase in contexts where intent could be more clearly inferred from surrounding grammar. The pattern that emerged was consistent. Velashin relationships in Venkaran historical texts were not initiated by individuals. They were sanctioned by institutions. The individuals chosen were selected because they exhibited the right qualities: patience, observational precision, the ability to hold contradiction without forcing resolution. But the selection itself was institutional. That meant the cadet had been sent to make this offer. The lead delegate had sanctioned it. The delegation collectively had agreed. And that meant the Venkaran government, or whatever functional equivalent existed, had decided, based on 14 months of careful exchange with humanity, that this was the appropriate next step. They weren't proposing a formal diplomatic channel. They already had one. They were proposing something adjacent to it, a parallel thread, less formal, more honest. A relationship between 2 people whose function was to watch and report, who could communicate what their institutions were missing without the distortions that formal diplomatic language introduced. It was, Voss reflected in the margins of his own report, arguably the most sophisticated diplomatic move he had ever encountered. It acknowledged the limitation of official channels without undermining them. It created a mechanism for genuine understanding without requiring either side to commit to anything beyond a conversation. And it was being offered to a mid-ranking xenolinguist analyst who had been sent to watch and not speak. Fenn called him at hour 53. The connection was slightly delayed. The INS Chandra had repositioned during the night for a scheduled maintenance window, and signal routing added half a second of lag. I've read the report, Fenn said. And I've sent it to 3 people who've each read it and asked me to confirm that it's real. It's real. Pause. The 17 recommendations. 16 of them are procedural: how to handle the next session, what language to use or avoid, how to manage the acknowledgement of the cadet statement without triggering an obligation we haven't cleared. Voss was already at his desk, notepad open. The 17th is the one that matters. Yes. Another pause. You're recommending we accept the proposal. I'm recommending Earth consider accepting it with full understanding of what it entails. Those are different things. Walk me through why. Voss had prepared for this. Because the Venkara have signaled, through this offer, that they want to go deeper than formal exchange. They've been patient. They've been careful. They've spent 14 months building a communication framework that they could have rushed if they'd chosen to. They haven't rushed anything. He tapped his pen on the notepad. Declining the offer, or ignoring it, which is functionally the same thing, signals to them that Earth is only capable of operating through formal channels. That we can't handle the kind of layered, long-term engagement they're proposing. He paused. For a species that's navigated first contact multiple times, that might be a disqualifying signal. And accepting? Accepting signals that we're serious about genuine engagement. Not just exchange, actual mutual understanding. He looked at the cabin's small porthole, the slow blackness of space beyond it. It also means I'd be operating in a role that has no formal precedent in UEDC protocols, with unclear boundaries, reporting to an institutional structure that isn't sure how to classify what I'd be doing. That's a generous description, Fenn said. More honestly, you'd be operating with no formal authority, representing humanity in conversations that could shape the trajectory of this entire relationship, with no safety net if something goes wrong. Yes. And you think we should do it anyway? I think, Voss said carefully, that the Venkara are offering humanity something that most first contact scenarios don't include, the chance to understand each other before we need to, before there's a crisis that forces it. He set the pen down. Most of Earth's historical first contact failures, between our own civilizations, happened because the parties involved waited until they needed to understand each other to start trying. By then, misunderstanding had already calcified into position. He picked the pen back up. The Venkara are proposing we start now, while things are still open. Fenn was quiet for several seconds. If I take this to the full UEDC board, he finally said, they'll spend 6 months forming a committee to evaluate the proposal and produce a framework for evaluating the framework. I know. Which means any decision that gets made in the next 18 hours has to come from me. I know that too. The lag made the silence feel longer than it was. The cadet, Fenn said. You've said they're young? That their designation suggests junior status? Yes. Why would they send someone young for something this significant? Voss looked at the page in his notepad where he'd written that question on the first day and circled it 3 times. He'd found an answer now, or at least a version of one. Because Velashan relationships are designed to last decades, he said. They're not built for the current moment. They're built for the long arc. He paused. They sent someone young because they're thinking about where this relationship will be in 30 years. And they want someone who will still be there. Another silence. How old are you, Voss? 41. Young enough, Fenn said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite humor and not quite weight, but somewhere in the space between. I'll call you back in 2 hours. The connection closed. Voss looked at his notepad. He'd been writing throughout, not notes this time. A letter of sorts to no one in particular. Trying to articulate the thing he hadn't included in the formal report because reports weren't the right medium for it. He was, underneath the analysis and the careful language, genuinely curious about this. Not as a professional. As a person. He wanted to know who the cadet was. What they saw when they looked at the gallery. What Velashan felt like from the inside of a Venkaran life. He wanted, with the particular quiet hunger of someone who had spent their career on the edges of human understanding, to understand something truly new. He wrote that down too. The authorization came in writing at hour 57 from Director Fenn, with the signatures of Ambassadors Chen and Okonkwo appended. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph confirmed that Voss was authorized to engage directly with the Venkara cadet in a non-formal capacity, at the discretion of the senior diplomatic team. The second established reporting requirements, daily summaries, flagged communications for any significant exchanges, immediate escalation if the content of any interaction indicated a material change in Venkaran intent. The third paragraph was a single sentence. This authorization does not create formal diplomatic status. Commander Voss acts as an individual, not as a representative of the United Earth Diplomatic Corps or its institutional positions. He understood why that was there. Plausible deniability if things went sideways. The ability to say that nothing official had been committed. He didn't resent it. It was prudent in the same way that keeping the INS Chandra 12,000 kilometers away was prudent, not because anyone expected violence but because distance preserved options. He also understood that the sentence meant something else. If this worked, the institution could claim it. If it didn't, Elias Voss had been operating as a private individual. That was fine. He'd known that before he submitted the report. The second session had been scheduled for 1400 ship time. 47 minutes before that, Ambassador Chen found him in the observation gallery, the same place he'd been sitting when it all began, and told him that the Venkara delegation had requested a modification to the session format. They'd asked whether it would be possible for one member of the Meridian's crew to be present in the chamber during the initial period, in a non-speaking observer capacity. The modification request had specified the crew member identified in gallery position during first session. They're precise, Voss said. Remarkably, Chen agreed. What did you tell them? That we were considering it. She looked at him steadily. I'm asking for your read. Is this escalation or continuation? He thought about it. It's a step. They're moving the process forward. But they're doing it carefully, observer capacity, not speaker capacity. They're not asking you to give me formal standing. They're asking you to put me in the room, which is a smaller ask. He paused. It's consistent with Velashian framework. You build contact gradually. You don't make a leap. Can you handle being in the room without formal standing and without speaking unless addressed? Yes. And if the cadet addresses you directly? Then I respond as a person, not as an institution. He looked at the porthole. Which is, I think, exactly what they're asking for. He entered the reception chamber at 1352. Not at the table. A chair had been placed at a slight angle near the gallery side wall, clearly positioned to be visible but clearly not seated with the diplomatic team. Somewhere between participant and observer. A deliberate in-between. The Venkara delegation entered at 1400 exactly. The lead delegate acknowledged Ambassadors Chen and Okonkwo with the dual hand gesture that the xenobiology team had confirmed as a high register greeting, used between equals, not between superior and subordinate. That was meaningful and Voss noted it. The cadet entered last. For a moment, both of them, the cadet and Voss, simply existed in the same room and nothing happened. Then the cadet looked at him and the expression he'd first seen in the gallery was back. Specific, intentional, carrying something he still didn't have the vocabulary for. The formal session proceeded. 15 minutes in, during a structured pause while the translation team processed a complex framework proposal, the cadet turned to face Voss fully and spoke. The translation feed rendered it, 7 seconds later, in his earpiece. You have read the words I sent you. Not a question. An observation offered for confirmation. Voss nodded once. Then, because the Venkara's visual range included UV bands that human nods might not fully register in the same way, he added, quietly, carefully, using the simplest grammatical structure the communication corpus supported. Yes. I have read them. The cadet's response took longer than normal. Holmes' voice in his secondary earpiece. They're constructing something complex. Give it a moment. It came through 30 seconds later with an unusual confidence interval notation. 81%, higher than most exchanges reached. You did not understand all of it. That is expected. I did not understand all of you either when I watched from the ship. This is the starting point, not the failure. Voss felt something shift, very quietly, in his assessment of what was happening. He'd been treating this as a diplomatic puzzle. The cadet was treating it as the beginning of a conversation. He responded in simple structure. What did you see when you watched? The cadet's answer when it came was 3 sentences. The translation rendered them cleanly, 79% confidence. Someone who was present but not performing. Someone who was writing down what others were not writing. Someone who was thinking about what it meant, not only what it appeared to be. Voss looked at the cadet for a long moment. That is what I was doing, he said. Yes, the cadet said. It is also what I was doing. When you looked at us, I was looking at you looking at us. We were doing the same thing. And there it was, the thing the formal report hadn't quite captured, the thing no analysis framework had a column for. 2 observers. Looking at each other across the distance between 2 civilizations. Recognizing the posture. That is why I chose you, the cadet said through the translation feed, in a voice that even the algorithm's approximation couldn't flatten of its particular quality. Not because you were important. Because you were honest. Voss wrote one word in his notepad. Reciprocal. The Velashian framework, as it came to be designated in UEDC internal documentation, was never announced publicly. That was a deliberate choice, made by Ambassador Chen, confirmed by Director Fenn, and quietly supported by every analyst who'd had any proximity to the Meridian mission. The reasoning was sound. Public announcement would create pressure for the relationship to perform, to produce visible results on a timeline that served political cycles rather than genuine understanding. The Venkara had built something designed to operate over decades. Subjecting it to quarterly review by Earth's media apparatus would be like planting a tree and digging it up every 3 months to check if it had roots. So the framework lived in classified summaries, in careful language that described VOS as a supplementary analytical channel, in meeting logs that noted informal exchange sessions without fully characterizing their content. What actually happened over the 26 months that followed the Meridian mission was something considerably more significant. VOS met with the Cadet, whose name, rendered as close as the translation corpus could manage in English phonology, approximated to Saville, 11 times. 3 aboard the Meridian during subsequent formal sessions, 4 during what became a standardized secondary channel format aboard a neutral transfer station at the L4 point, 4 more via the structured communication link that the Venkaran technical team and Earth Signal Division had built together over 6 months of careful work. None of the meetings were long. The longest was 3 hours. Most ran 90 minutes to 2. They were not debriefs. They were not interrogations or intelligence exchanges. They were conversations, careful, layered, often slow, frequently returning to earlier exchanges to revise understanding in light of new context. VOS kept notes. Saville, he eventually learned, kept an equivalent, a recording format that the Venkara used for documents requiring what translated most closely as accumulated weight, meaning content that would mean different things when read at different points in a life. What they talked about, broadly, was the gap. The gap between what formal exchanges communicated and what was actually meant. The gap between what Earth's diplomatic teams believed the Venkara wanted and what the Venkara actually wanted. The gap between what Venkaran communication assumed Earth would understand and what Earth actually understood. Every formal session produced misreadings, small ones usually, sometimes significant ones, and the Velashan channel was where those misreadings were identified and corrected before they could calcify into assumption. It was not glamorous work. It was the kind of work that leaves no monuments, but its effects accumulated. In month 7, the formal diplomatic teams avoided a significant misstep when a Venkaran treaty proposal used a grammatical structure that Earth's translation team read as a demand for exclusivity in a resource-sharing framework. It was, in fact, a traditional structural formality with no exclusivity implication. VOS caught it through Saville's offhand mention of frustration at the Earth team's apparent resistance to the proposal, a resistance that made no sense to the Venkara because the exclusivity implication wasn't there. He flagged it to Holm, who verified it in the corpus and escalated to Chin. The diplomatic team adjusted their response. The treaty moved forward. In month 12, Saville raised a concern, carefully, indirectly, in the specific way that VOS had learned indicated Venkaran discomfort with direct criticism, about the INS Chandra's repositioning patterns during the L4 station meetings. The frigate had been following updated security protocols, running variable interval sensor sweeps that Earth's military considered standard practice. From the Venkaran perspective, the patterns looked like escalating surveillance during periods of sensitive exchange. It had been generating institutional anxiety in the Venkaran delegation for 2 months. VOS brought it to Asker, who brought it to the Chandra's command. The sweep pattern was modified. The anxiety resolved. Nothing in the formal diplomatic record indicated it had ever existed. In month 19, VOS asked Saville directly why the Venkara had chosen Earth as the next species for extended engagement when, based on everything Saville had shared, there were other spacefaring civilizations within contact range. Saville's answer took 2 sessions to fully develop, because the concept required careful layering in translation. What it amounted to, rendered in VOS's notes. Earth is unusual because you are still afraid of your own reach. Most species at this stage of development have either resolved that fear or been destroyed by it. You are afraid and you are still reaching anyway. That combination is rare. VOS had sat with that for a long time. It wasn't praise. It wasn't the kind of elevated claim about human exceptionalism that made for easy stories. It was something more nuanced, an observation about a species caught in a particular moment of its development, handling the anxiety of expansion imperfectly but honestly, which apparently registered as meaningful to a civilization that had seen what happened when that anxiety was either suppressed or denied. He wrote it down and then wrote underneath it, "They are not choosing us because we are great. They are choosing us because we are still becoming." There is a difference. The formal diplomatic relationship between Earth and the Venkara at the 26-month mark had produced 3 framework agreements, 1 joint scientific working group on atmospheric chemistry, a preliminary cultural archive exchange, and a standing communication protocol that allowed for regular non-emergency contact between designated stations. By the metrics that Earth's institutions measured, it was a success. By the metrics that Voss had come to think mattered more, the depth, the texture, the degree to which each side actually understood what it was dealing with, it was a beginning. He was 43 now. Saville, based on developmental markers that the xenobiology team had slowly refined their understanding of, was the equivalent of somewhere in their mid-20s by human analogy. The math, as Voss had noted in the margins of his very first Velashian notes, worked out. He submitted his 26th monthly summary to Director Fenn on a Tuesday morning, Earth calendar, while sitting in the same cabin he'd been assigned during the Meridian mission. They'd kept it for him, a small institutional acknowledgement of something they couldn't quite formally acknowledge. The summary was 12 pages. It included 3 flagged items for the diplomatic team, 1 recommendation for the translation corpus team, and a single personal note at the end that Fenn had told him, months ago, to keep including because it was the only part of the document that felt like it was written by a human being rather than a process. The note read, "Saville asked me this session what I thought humanity would look like in 50 years. I said I didn't know, that we were bad at predicting ourselves, that we tended to surprise ourselves in both directions." Saville said the Venkara had found the same to be true. I asked if that was frustrating. They said no. They said the ones who can still surprise themselves are the ones worth knowing. I think that's the most honest thing anyone has said about this in 2 years. I wanted to put it somewhere official. End of summary. He sent it. Then he opened a new page in his notepad, analog, deliberately so, the same kind he'd carried onto the Meridian 18 months ago, and began drafting notes for the next session. Outside the porthole, the stars were the same as they'd always been, indifferent, vast, and everywhere. Not waiting for humanity. Not judging it. Just there. The distance between them and Earth was the same as it had always been too. It was just that humanity had started, carefully and imperfectly and with a great deal of bureaucratic argumentation about proper authorization, to close some of it. One conversation at a time.